vacation.
Are you really?
If you'd like to join and maybe cool off.
That's very comfortable in here.
Yeah.
It's not out there.
Oh, yeah.
It's like a wall.
You want to sit down here, Scott? Yeah.
May as well. Take the load off.
Go ahead. This is my chair.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here. Can everybody hear me okay? Or do I need a microphone?
Just
or
a
anything?
little.
Okay, all right. I'll try to speak up. But thank you all for being here. I'm Brian Johnson, and I wrote the book Murder in Chisago County, which was published 5 years ago by the History Press. And I just want to say it's really great to be back in Harris. I really enjoy it up here in East Central Minnesota. The people are so friendly, and you've always been very welcoming when I've been up. I'm from from the Minneapolis, the Twin Cities. I grew up in Minneapolis, and I currently live in West St. Paul. But my mother grew up in Rush City, and she remembers very well what happened here on April 10th, 1933. She passed away 4 years ago, but that was part of my reason for writing this book, was to get down and print some of my mother's memories and just to have a public record of what happened here with this family and of this tragic story. And you probably all know the story, but just to give you a little synopsis, it was the night of April 10th to 11th, 1933, family of 9 people, Alvin and Elvira Johnson and their 7 children, lived in a farm home in Harris, Minnesota. And in the middle of the night, their house caught on fire, and a neighbor named Ragnar Krantz discovered the fire. He alerted the authorities, but by the time the fire department from Rush City got there, the home was almost completely burned down. And inside what was left of the home, the authorities found the remains of Elvira Johnson and her 7 children, ages 4 months to 10 years, 5 boys, 2 girls. And it was later determined by the investigators that the victims were probably dead before the fire. So it went from being a fire investigation to a murder investigation. Strangely enough, Alvin's remains were not found in the fire, and so fingers immediately pointed to him as the suspect. And he disappeared and was never seen again, despite international manhunt that really extended even into Canada. So that's kind of the story in a nutshell. Why I wrote the book. As I said, my mother was 12 years old when this happened, and she remembered it quite clearly. And to me, it's always been a personal thing, because I remember my great-grandmother, who was Elvira's mother. She lived to be 100 years old, despite living through some very tragic times, including, of course, this terrible, tragic fire. And I was amazed at how strong she was to be able to just keep going, despite this horrific event that happened. And I remember visiting her at the nursing home. My brother and I would go up there with our family, usually maybe a couple times a year. She was born on Christmas Eve, 1871. And we would go there, and my mother would bake a Christmas tree-shaped cake to take to my great-grandmother, and we would celebrate her birthday. And she died a month after her 100th birthday in January of 1972. So I have memories of my great-grandmother, who was Elvira's mother, who was really, which really makes it real to me, that I had that direct connection with this, with what happened. And just, I guess, to back up a little bit, Elvira was my great aunt, my grandmother's younger sister. So my mother's younger sister was Elvira Lundeen Johnson, who was the mother of the 7 children who died in the fire. And when I was a kid, we would always go up and pay our respects at the First Lutheran Cemetery in Rush City, where Elvira and the children are buried in a single grave. It just says Elvira Lundeen Johnson and their 7 children died April 10th, 1933. And so we would go up there from the time I was a little kid and pay our respects, and that's part of what made it real to me. But it wasn't, when I was a kid, I always thought it was just a terrible accident, a tragic fire, an accidental fire. It wasn't until later that I became curious about finding out more about what happened, that I started to do some research. My brother did some research as well with me, and we slowly uncovered more and more information about the disappearance of Alvin Johnson and his alleged role in what happened. And so I just became more and more curious about it. I was a journalism major in college, and then after I graduated from college, I said, well, I should write an article about this. So I wrote an article in the early 90s. It was published in the ECM Post Review in April of 1992. So this was almost 60 years after the fire. And I think that was really the first time anyone had written about this in almost 60 years. So it had been lost to history, pretty much. I'm sure some of the locals and old timers remembered it, but as far as anybody actually writing about this, it had been pretty much lost to history. So I wanted to keep that history alive, and I wanted people to remember this family, the mother and the children. And it's also such a compelling story, it's hard not to be fascinated by it, I guess. So, just kind of a little background into what happened. After the fire was discovered, the investigators searched for Alvin Johnson. They dragged the river. Hundreds of volunteers showed up to look for him. The manhunt extended into Canada, where Alvin he had some connections there. In the World War I era, he had worked up there in the logging camps. And so there was some suspicion that he might have somehow made his way back there and had perhaps changed his identity, or somehow maybe even started a new life. But there were a number of sightings throughout the country, actually even as far east, I believe it was Pennsylvania, into Montana, up in Canada. But those either ended up, of course, being false alarms, or somehow Alvin Johnson, if he did do this and did get out of Dodge, he somehow managed to keep one step ahead of the law, because he was never arrested or captured or anything like that. So this was during the Depression, so it wasn't unusual to see people wandering out looking for work, trying to figure out how to support themselves. And of course, it was long before the age of the internet and 24-hour news. So, they put out wanted posters. There was the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. We're looking into it on the north of the border. But nobody came up with any answers as to what might have happened to him. So, a little bit at what the law enforcement folks were looking at. The victims were found in their sleeping positions, and so they concluded that if they had been alive at the time of the fire, there would have been some indication that someone would have tried to get out of the house somehow. So that was one, the authorities placed a lot of weight on that, thinking that that was a pretty mysterious thing. And also they had found some firearms there, a gas can. There could have been obviously some innocent reasons for having those there, but when they put the pieces together, it was enough to convince a grand jury that Alvin Johnson, there was reasonable cause to believe that he had done this, and then he disappeared. So he was indicted by a grand jury in October of 1933, but obviously never went to trial because they didn't find him. So when I wrote my article in the early 90s for the ECM Post Review, there were some folks still alive back then who remembered this, and were even, Elsie Anderson was one of the old timers, an elderly lady at the time, who was an adult when this happened. And I remember hearing her say that she was so convinced that Alvin Johnson did this and that he made it to Canada. So I personally give a lot of credence to that because she was, like I said, an adult when this happened. She remembered it well. And other people, though, on the other side of the fence, Alvin had his defenders. He had a brother-in-law named Harry Galpin who was convinced that Alvin died in the fire like everybody else, and that somehow the authorities were either maliciously tampered with the evidence or tried to cover it up. There's a tone of kind of a conspiracy theory around his theories for why, he believed that, and Galpin at one point wrote a long affidavit to the county and said, look, he alleged misconduct on the part of the authorities. He said they botched the investigation, and he believed that they had reason to justify the fact that they were spending taxpayer money looking for this man all over the country and into Canada, and they had to justify that by saying, yeah, he did this, we're gonna have to capture him. And so I'm not sure I'm sure he passionately believed that, but I believe the evidence is there that somehow Alvin, for some reason, snapped and did this and then made it off to parts unknown, who knows where. There are other theories that maybe Alvin's brothers had something to do with this. He had brothers, one brother in particular, younger brother named Hank Johnson. He was quite a character. And one of our local friends here, Jim Carlbaum, actually worked for Hank Johnson back in the day in the 60s, and he loved Hank. People loved Hank, but there were also those who thought maybe if he had been drinking too much, there was a dark side to him too. And so there were some people who believed that the brothers were behind this and that they wanted the farm, they wanted to take over the land and somehow get Alvin out of the way. I don't know if I believe that, but that's just one of those theories. There are other theories that maybe Alvin had crossed the wrong people and got himself in trouble with some mobsters or something of that nature. He had supposedly worked, did some moonshining in western Wisconsin, and that he could have maybe crossed the wrong people. I don't know what to believe, what to think about that, but that was another theory. And one interesting theory is that one of the neighbors was seen just hours after this happened, when the neighbors was seen disking the field next door, which was kind of odd because it would have been very early in the morning, and they later saw Alvin's dog circling a particular area looking for his master, supposedly. So there are all kinds of theories out there about what might have happened. One thing we know about Alvin, the family was very poor. He wouldn't have had a lot of money to make a getaway except for the fact that we do know that he borrowed money from his brother Hank to make a first month's rent on a new place in Rush City. He had borrowed that money just the weekend before this happened, so he might have had some money when he made his getaway. And we do know also that Alvin, at the time this happened, was being evicted from the farm. His father, Emil Johnson, owned the farm, and Alvin wasn't able to pay the rent, was supposedly behind, way behind in the rent. And so he was, when the fire happened, there was a big wagon outside in front of the home with all the family's belongings on it, and they were ready to move. So I think it was just a desperate time in their lives, and that perhaps Alvin snapped. Perhaps he had been suffering from some kind of mental illness or severe depression, and this is just, he felt like he couldn't carry on with supporting his family. Not to make any excuses for him, but that, because it's a terrible crime, obviously, but I think there might have been something else going on inside his head. So we know that we don't know much about Alvin himself. He was kind of a mysterious character in his own right. We do know that his parents were Swedish immigrants. He grew up here. His first language was English. He went to school, I think, through the 8th grade or something like that. They were raised in the Lutheran Church here. Emil Johnson was one of the founding members of the Harris Lutheran Church, from what I understand, and helped build the church. They were considered pillars of the community, but other people thought that there was also a dark side to Emil, that he might have been abusive. And the brothers were all considered kind of rough, tough characters. One of Alvin's sisters, Esther, actually married a professional boxer named Walter Lodge, who was one of Jack Dempsey's favorite sparring partners back in the 1920s. So there's a little side note about that in my book. As far as Elvira, what we know about her is that I just think she was just a devoted mother who cared deeply for her family and did the very best to support her and take care of her family and her kids in what was a very difficult time. And my mother remembered that when they were kids, she used to play with Elvira's kids, and they would go to Elvira's house, and her mother, my mother's mother, would say, when you go there, don't eat too much, because this family is very poor and they don't have a lot, so don't eat too much. And my mother would say, yeah, but it was hard because the food was so good. Elvira was such a good cook. And my mother also wondered when she was a little kid why Santa Claus never visited Elvira's family. So, but I do know, one thing that I learned in doing my research for this book was that the Red Cross at the time checked in on Elvira's family because they knew they were very poor, and the Red Cross would do that from time to time back in the day, and they concluded that Elvira's kids were among the least destitute of any families they looked after. So that tells me that Elvira, despite all the difficulties, she really was a good mother and took care of her kids. But I can imagine what it must have been like to have 7 young children, ages 4 months to 10 years, and just doing the laundry, just feeding them, obviously this was long before microwave ovens and things like that, and modern conveniences, so I'm sure she had a difficult life. But I guess when I look back on when I was doing my research for this book, I think one of my favorite things, for sure my favorite thing, was just visiting with the locals here and hearing their stories and talking to people like Jim Carlbaum, Wenzel Lindholm, I think his name was, Nan Holt in North Branch. It was just an honor for me, really, to meet those people and to get firsthand their stories, Kellyanne Hokinson. I think that's what really kind of brought the story to life, because these people might not have been around when it happened, but they heard the stories from parents and grandparents, and it's still, this is a story that nobody in the Twin Cities, I grew up in Minneapolis, nobody had ever heard about this, nobody. But here in Rush City, Harris, North Branch area, people had heard about it, they'd heard the story through the years. And that was interesting to me, and I wanted to capture some of those thoughts and theories and memories in my book. And like I said, I think that was my favorite part of doing this research. I also looked at period newspapers from the 30s, which covered in great detail what happened in the immediate aftermath after the fire. I tried to get a hold of the grand jury records. Normally grand jury records are not made public to protect the innocent people. But I appealed to a county judge to get the grand jury records because it happened so long ago, and I said in the interest of history, my mother was still alive at the time, people want to know what happened, and I believe they were willing to release the records, except that the records disappeared. So, that's a little, I guess it happens when you're talking about something that happened so many years ago and just paper records and things like that. But it would be nice if those records would turn up so we could get a little more information about what the grand jury heard when they indicted Alvin. So, that's kind of what I know in a nutshell. It was really great to meet folks up here and to dig a little deeper into what happened. Even though it was a terribly sad and tragic story, as I said, my goal was to sort of bring the memory of this family alive and to have future generations know their story and know that they existed and know that they, at one time, this was a family with hopes and dreams and young children who should have had a bright future in front of them. So, and I guess that's my story in a nutshell. I have some photos. I don't know if anyone has any questions, but I wanted to run through some photos too. Does anyone have any questions about what happened or what might have happened or why? What I
No,
came
you're
across in my
talking about
research?
remembering history.
Yeah.
I've lived here my whole life. I'm 63,
Mhm.
right? I didn't hear about this until a year ago. 6 months
Yeah.
to a year
When
ago.
we
I was
read
like,
your book.
what?
Okay.
We've got a presentation.
I could
Yeah.
not believe it. I'm like, yeah, cause I know where Panati lives, I know,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, everything.
Mr.
And-
Panati was great, yeah, I
Yeah.
talked to him, and, yeah.
Yep. I was shocked.
It's interesting because, yeah, on the one hand, like I said, some people had heard about it, but other people had no idea.
Yeah,
I think it was just something that was really difficult to talk about,
yeah.
because, one of the gentlemen I worked with in doing research for the book was, and I think I mentioned this story in the book, is that he was looking at some property close to where this happened, and he said something about, well, that's close to the old Johnson place, or someone said that's close to the old Johnson place, and then, you know, but they didn't wanna talk about what happened there, so.
Yeah,
And
yeah, I
Cliff-
imagine.
Cliff, the gentleman who bought the property and built a new house there, Cliff Bedell, he was also, he knew the whole history of what happened there. And up to a certain amount of time, he was more than happy to talk about it. He invited me and my mother and family up to the place where you could still see part of the foundation from the old
Sure.
house. But then I think Cliff got kind of tired of talking about it, so he's like, he didn't wanna do any more interviews, but, no, it's fascinating that, he had people in 2 different camps. He had people who thought that, yeah, absolutely, Alvin Johnson killed his family and he took off, and then he had people who said, nah, he never could have done that. So,
Wasn't there a fairly big reward offered?
$50.
$50. Which probably wasn't a lot.
Yeah,
Cause during the Depression,
it
right?
was during the Depression.
I mean, $50 would get you quite a bit of it.
That was the Pinkertons. My great-grandmother hired the Pinkertons to look into it. And, that's where the wanted poster comes from, and I'm sure you've seen it at the
Okay.
Stuga.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, $50 reward. It's funny, when I wrote about this, when one of the local city pages interviewed me about the book, they got it wrong. They said the reward is $50,000. No, it's $50, 50.
That's still quite a bit though for that time.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I think she scraped together what little money she had to come up with that reward money. And,
Yeah, that had to be tough too.
yeah. But they're searching for answers. Some people, I believe, I think my mother even said at one point that she was, looking at doing I wanna say seance, but that's not exactly right. Talking to someone who is
Like a clairvoyant
Exactly.
person, see if
Yeah.
they could
Yeah,
get
yeah.
a reading from them.
Right,
And do you know if anything ever happened with that?
I don't know.
There's a lot of, what do I wanna say, mystically, magically things about the valley in general, lots of stories about
Yeah.
stuff happening down there, people doing some strange stuff like that, so.
Well, and my aunt, Betty Colas, my mother's younger sister, unfortunately Betty just died a few months ago, but she was a big help to me too in sharing what she remembered. She was only 4 years old when it happened, so she didn't remember a lot. But she did remember going to the house, and she remembers they had water in big barrels of water there, that's where they got their water for, cooking and drinking, I guess, and everything. But anyway, she remembered visiting after the fire, after all this happened. She was about 7 or 8 years old. She remembered visiting the scene, and she said she just got chills up and down her spine, just gave her the creeps, and she couldn't wait to get out of there.
Do you know if there was like a funeral or anything held
Yes.
afterward?
Yes, there was a funeral, and from what I recall from the newspaper coverage, hundreds of people showed up to pay their respects. There was an obituary in the Rush City News that was actually kind of disappointing. That was pretty short and not a lot of details.
Probably on purpose,
Probably on purpose, yeah, because,
to stop the rumor mill?
yes. And I guess maybe it's because they don't wanna, it's maybe too sensitive to talk about or to write about. Although the papers did cover in great detail how the search played out and things like that. But it was at the funeral, they didn't even say much about Elvira and the kids in the obituary. It just said that Elvira was a hardworking mother, this is a great loss and everything, so.
Brian,
Yeah.
didn't Mom talk about how she was somehow at the night of the fire, she was sleeping in the living room and the
Yes.
phone rang and
Yeah.
she remembered her mother screaming or something when she heard what happened?
Yeah.
And something in the middle of the night.
Yeah, this is my brother Mark here, and that's exactly right. She remembered, for some reason, she wasn't sleeping in her normal bed, in her bedroom that night. She was sleeping on the floor in the living room or something.
Yeah.
And then she heard they got a call in the middle of the night, and with this terrible news, and her mother just screamed, right?
Yeah.
And then someone had called, another of the sisters. So my great-grandmother was one of 4 sisters. There was Elvin, Olga, Elvira, and Frida. Frida was my grandmother. And someone had called Olga with the news, one of the other sisters, and Olga fainted, right?
Yeah.
That was a story from my mother's bruise from Olga's son. And she fainted when she heard the news, so.
And our grandma didn't really ever wanna talk about it,
Oh,
I don't
gosh,
think.
no.
She wouldn't talk about it at all.
She lived to be quite old too. It's funny, in my family, there's a lot of, the women lived to be quite old. My great-grandmother was 100, as I said. My grandmother, Elvira's sister, lived to be 98, almost 99. And our mother was 3 days short of her 99th birthday when she died on March 23rd, 2020, right during the pandemic. So, but yeah, my grandmother never talked. We used to go out there, and she lived in Oregon. We used to go out there and visit every summer and ride the train out there and visit. I mean, we didn't really bring it up, but she certainly didn't volunteer any information. And nor did great-grandmother, I'm sure.
Right.
What do you remember about visiting great-grandma she was at the Green Acres Nursing Home
Yep,
in North Branch.
Poor
yep,
farm.
The Poor Farm, yeah,
yeah.
right, the old Poor Farm. And I remember it just being kind of a creepy place.
Yep.
They had a player piano there, I believe. And what else? What do you remember about it?
I don't know.
Didn't they grow like their own vegetables and stuff
I think so.
out there?
Yeah.
It was kind of, it wasn't like nobody like really like owned the place. It was like where you went if you had nowhere else to go for a
Right,
while.
right,
In
yeah.
the early days.
Yeah. I just remember my great-grandmother's room was just small and nothing special. And she had a picture of Jesus and a picture of President Kennedy.
Yeah.
But yeah, and there was another old lady there who gave us candy or something.
Right, that was supposedly mom's kindergarten teacher or something.
Yeah. But anyway, there are some people there who some of the residents were, I think, had mental illness too, and.
Yeah, it was kind of a catch-all place.
Yeah.
Yep.
So.
Do you think like manners and just social interaction of the time played a part in how much people talked about it? I mean, because I grew up with my grandma, you know, coaching me on how to behave, you know, politely.
Yeah.
And some things were just like, you don't talk about that.
Right.
You know, and so
Right.
if this was so sensitive, I wonder if there were a good amount of people who are like, shush.
Exactly.
Yep,
You
And
know,
I think it was just painful too. I think that my mom,
yep.
it really,
Oh.
till even shortly before she died, if my brother talked about it, you could tell, she would bring it up sometimes, and you could tell it was still really painful for her
She
to
didn't
hear
even-
about and think about.
She
And
probably didn't get to process it.
yeah, it was really hard. She didn't like to talk about it. It was upsetting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and back then, you know, now there's a lot of awareness about mental health and things like that, but back then they didn't have the
Nothing.
resources to deal with that, and
Right,
I'm sure there weren't counselors like there would be today.
right.
So, yeah, it's very difficult for her to talk about. And they're Swedish too. You know, the old Swedes, to this day, Swedes. You know, you don't talk about stuff like that. In fact, I was just watching a little Swedish video. I studied Swedish at the U of M, so I speak Swedish and whatever. It's neither here nor there, but I get these clips from Swedish television, and there's a little snippet with these immigrants who have lived in Sweden for like 30 years, right? This is a humorous little bit, and the old man says to the younger daughter, like, I just want to talk to people, but nobody wants to talk to me and everything. And she says, well, Papa, that's because you always talk about, you know, like what's happening with the Kurds in Iraq now and all this, you know, who are you going to vote for and all this other stuff. And she says, when you talk to Swedes, you just have to talk about the weather. End of conversation.
It's always safe.
Right. But that's part of it too, I think, the Swedish, like, you know.
It was about respect.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not gonna invade your personal bubble with my
Right.
questions and whatever, yeah.
Yeah. But, I have a few pictures here if you're interested, and just, you know, if you maybe, wanna
Hit the light?
turn on the light. I think I figured out how to work this thing. Whoops. Okay, let's see if I can get this fired up again here. Alright. Okay. So, I don't need that. I don't need that. There. So here on the left there, that's my great grandmother with the funny hat. And that's her mother. That's Christine Lundeen, Elvira's mother. And this is in the middle. That's her mother, Anestina.
Yeah.
And then on the woman on the right there is, I believe, Auntie Christine, one of the relatives. I think her name was, they just called her Auntie Christine. I can't remember her full name, but here's a good picture of the whole family. This is my grandmother, my great grandmother and great grandfather sitting down. My great grandfather died in 1936, so this would have been 3 years after the fire. And one thing I understand from my mother was that's one thing that got great grandmother through, was after the fire. Obviously a terrible thing, but she had to keep it together because she had her husband was in poor health at the time, and she threw herself into taking care of him. And this is up here, so this is these are the four sisters. This is Ellen, Cher, this is Elvira here, and this is Olga, and this is my grandmother. Her name was Frida Lundeen Peterson.
They're adorable.
Yeah. So
Same.
my great grandmother lived the longest of any of these. She died in 2000. I think Ellen died in like 1987, something like that, and then Olga died in the 1950s. Let's see, who else do we have here? Here's a I really like this picture. This is Elvira's confirmation picture. Yeah, she was born in November 15th, 1903. So she was 29 when she lost her life there.
And weren't her parents kind of unhappy about her getting together with Alvin and
Yes.
their marriage? And
Yes, my great grandparents didn't approve of her marriage to Alvin Johnson. Part of it was that Alvin was 14 years older than she was. Alvin was born in January of 1890, and I think he was just kind of I know that they didn't approve of the marriage. So, shoot, what else do I have here? Oh, I know, I want to show you this little quick, if I can pull up my YouTube page again. I thought I had this saved. Hang on. Oh, I don't want to go through signing in again.
I thought you just had it minimized.
I had it minimized, yeah. Anyway, new tab, and that's, no, I don't want a new tab, I want an old tab. Well, I was gonna show you a short clip of my sign in with the personal account. No, I don't wanna do that. Sign in. Well, maybe I can just do this. So I guess I'll just show you a couple more photos here that I have. I had an actual PowerPoint, but I brought the wrong laptop. I was on a different older laptop, so I'll have to just go with this. Here's another photo that I have of, my grandmother on the left there holding the dog, and then Elvira. They loved animals. They used to dress up pigs and things of that nature, from what I understand.
Do you have a picture of the kids, mom of the kids without?
I don't think so. Darn, I don't think so. There are just a few more pictures there. But I have a display here too with some pictures and some old news clippings. So of course you're welcome to look at that. I have some books here that I'm happy to sign if anybody's interested in getting a book.
I know a gal who is in the crowd.
And I guess I don't really have much more to say for the formal presentation, other than thank you so much for having me, and it's been an honor to be here and to see you folks, and thank you for your interest.